the way I would frame the problem is that I think you used the phrase, will President Biden give credit for consultative democracy? And I think the short answer to that question in terms of what I would anticipate him to do would be no, he's not going to do that. And then you would ask yourself, well, why? And I think this gets to the fundamental dilemma of our relationship. And it's equally true in Beijing and China more broadly, and in Washington and the United States. And that is the political calendar in both of our countries does not make being reasonable, conciliatory, and flexible very easy to do for either leader. Of course, Xi Jinping just had the 6th plenum, and by my reading it from his point of view, and was achieved what he wanted to achieve. But there is no reward in Chinese politics for being very flexible with the Americans. And if you look ahead to the 20th Party Congress coming up next year, it's going to be very difficult for, I would say, any Chinese leader, but I would think this is true with the current Chinese leadership, to be too flexible in the documents of the 6th Party Plenum. And there was a lot of concern about subversion from the US and its activities in Hong Kong and elsewhere. So I would say the level of suspicion in China of the US has not been diminished, and the domestic political situation in China does not reward leaders for being flexible and accommodating to the United States. And by the same token, it's at least as true in the United States. Next year, we have congressional elections that will dictate, or the results of which will dictate who controls both houses of Congress. And of course, that's why Biden is so desperate or anxious to get his legislation passed now, because he can't be sure he'll have a Congress that will pass it after the elections next year. And frankly, he either has to use his capital to pass legislation on infrastructure and building more social equity in the US. He doesn't want to spend his capital saying nice things about China that are going to be criticized. And then, of course, when we're past the 22 elections for Congress, we're going to be then into a campaign for the next president. And leave it aside whether Mr. Trump will be a major force in US politics and maybe a candidate, and I think both of those things are possible. The spirit of populism and what you might call Trumpism is very strong here in the United States. So all I'm saying is the domestic political environment in both our countries does not encourage either leader to be seen as weak by their respective publics. So that it's this concatenation of domestic inflexibility, nationalism in both our countries, exaggeration, rumor, and then, of course, the power relationship and the economic relationship is changing. So it's just as one observer said long time ago, it's an enigma wrapped up in a question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think your analysis really brought up this question about deglobalization, and nationalism, populism is running high probably in the United States and probably also in China. So that is really not good for the leaders to really have a deep dialogue and facing its own challenge. For example, you're right. President Biden is having this midterm election coming up of the Congress, and then on the Senate they are barely just have one more seat with the Vice President Harris there. So the dynamic can change. Also, they are losing a seat in the Virginia governor race recently to the Republicans. So that's exactly the dilemma we are facing. So I'm thinking of, U.S.-China, of course, have its own path of development. China basically is living in a world of democracy. U.S. probably is the largest opposition party. You got to be watched by all the countries and things like that. But China also have a domestic. They have a market. I would refer that as a market democracy or technology democracy. 1 billion smartphone users actually can decide what they do on a daily basis, voting every day. So somehow, I think this internal energy and synergy will continue. But I'm just thinking, yeah.
I was just going to say, you've mentioned a couple of times technology, and I mentioned that I thought part of the problem we've got is a technological race. And part of that technology race is over economic dominance and control, or at least success within the future industries. And I think just give one example, artificial intelligence. Now we have the capacity to delegate decisions within militaries to essentially machines. We have machines now with logarithms to determine what phrases will be selected for advertisements, for political advertisements, for propaganda. And the purpose of many of these mechanisms to select thought and exaggerate conflict. They exaggerate conflict within our own societies and between societies. So I think one of the new elements in our relationship is this technological race. It's partly for economic dominance, but technology has its own logic. And part of that logic seems to be to increase conflict. And also the delegation of military decisions to machines, I think, is a very dangerous trend that we have to be mindful of. So I think one of the new aspects here is technology. And how are we going to, as two countries, come together to cooperate to make sure that, so to speak, it's man running the machines and not the machines running man?
Yeah, right. Absolutely. I think that really, as I recall, it's really start from probably President Trump that he's really starting to really decouple and banning the use of companies like Huawei or ZTE, and then we see a host of companies being put on the list during the Trump administration. That kind of a decoupling in technology actually already happened somehow, and also that forced China to develop on its own now. So it's really not healthy. I think we use the technology to conquer, the universe and then everything, but not really into a arms race or military competition. Well, so that's not really great.
I'm not sure most Americans would agree with that, but the way I would put it is that because there is this decoupling going on, and in China, just like in the sense of the US, there's talk of self-reliance, because when you have security problems with a country, you want to depend on them for strategic items, whether it's food or machinery, high-tech machinery, or whatever. So that, but I think the United States sees China as increasing the state enterprise sector, because that's where some of your most advanced, but not all your most advanced firms are. And so I think the American storyline is China's increasing state control of key aspects of the economy, particularly in the security area. And therefore the United States, uses that as a justification to clamp down on exports of certain goods to China. It's working with Taiwan for a big investment in computer chips in the American Southwest. In other words, we're each responding by creating our own independent economic and technological subsystems. And when one side does it, the other side reacts. And so in a way, I don't find it very productive to say who started this. What I find it productive to say is we now are in a problem. So what are we jointly going to do to solve the problem?
Yes. Yeah, no, I think, David, you're right that, we do have a huge problem. I would probably interpret that somehow to the mistrust and of course also to misunderstanding to some extent. For example, in China, you know that SOE, China has always been a highly centralized country, thousands of year history, big irrigation project, across the geographically big country. So SOE or big gigantic project is always tackled by the state. And that really helps the, lift the 800 million people out of poverty, or having this big infrastructure project across the country, three gorgeous dams, or Hong Kong, Guangzhou, Macau, ocean bridges, those projects. So SOE play a unique role in China, but somehow is not really understood well outside China. But also, for example, the rural area. I mean, the Wi-Fi rate by the China Telecom and China Unicom has to be low so that they can really help in the villagers. Yeah. So there's a lot of understanding. I think we haven't really got that.
Well, I think you're right in terms of China's history, in terms of its rice culture. You've always needed to have big water projects that had to be almost initiated by government or very large government entities. You have a different history, a different geography you have to deal with, a much bigger population. But in the same token that I think we should better, or at least Americans should better understand China's particular circumstances, I think China needs to recognize our particular circumstances. And our particular circumstances are small and medium business is the backbone of the American economy. And even our biggest corporations, for the most part, have little or no direct ownership by our government. And so when in our politics, the private sector or small business looks at China and they say, how can we compete with state-financed corporations that have centralized or more centralized decision-making? So while it's understandable where China's economic and organization came from and why you do it, on the other hand, it's just precisely the kind of economic management and philosophy that scares a private sector, small and medium business-sized country. So we're not going to solve this problem. But I think for the last 40 years in the process of trying to get into WTO, and I hope we, along with China in its application to the TPP, the new version of TPP, I hope maybe we can move towards both trying to join that and once again, try to develop common, at least more common economic practices that will reduce the tension. So my basic feeling is the last few years where we didn't join AIIB or we didn't join TPP or you set up RCEP, we're growing apart. And it seems to me we have to get back in trying to grow a little more together. And we've got to take account of your needs for centralization and scale, but you need to take into account our demand by our private sector.
Yeah. Mhm. No, I think you're right. You know, we all have special circumstances. Of course, China has its characteristic, and U.S. has its characteristic. How we can really, minimize that gap and understand each other better. I think that a mechanism like a WTO, where I think multilateralism still really is the answer for that. I'm glad that you mentioned about RCEP and the CPTPP, and China joined one of them, and trying to join the other one, and that all actually very, very important mechanism for minimize the differences and enhance understanding. Because CPTPP is largely designed by the U.S. and China is willing to join that. Ministry of Commerce has put the CPTPP agreement on the MOFCOM website. Here's the target to shoot for. Let's do it. So that's probably the way to find much common ground and talk to each other, and that's through those multilateral arrangements.
Of course, I agree with that, but it's not going to be easy. That CPTPP has relatively high standards, market style standards. And so it will take work for China to comply. And frankly, in the United States, there are forces in the Democratic Party, not to mention the Republican Party, that don't like international economic regimes that they think constrains the United States too much. So the point is, I think that's the desirable way to go. But once again, particularly in this case, in the United States, neither political party, at least for the last few years and now, seems very comfortable with the idea, even though Japan took the lead after the US pulled out of the TPP discussions.
Yeah, I think now even UK now wants to join CPTPP, and China actually last year Premier Li actually announced that at the National People's Congress, and President Xi actually announced that at APEC Summit. China is very interested to join that, and also Minister Wang Huiyao of MOFCOM actually officially applied that just 2 months ago through New Zealand, where the document is deposited. What I think now is that actually, if you talk about 10 years ago when CPTPP just started, it was, maybe they think, China still follow up on the WTO, and the TPP is high standard. It's maybe not compatible to what China has been doing. But now, after 8-9 years later, China is actually catching up. For example, TPP is concerned about IPR. I mean, IPR, China has the largest patent applicants in the world now, and also TPP has a high environmental standard. And China, President Xi's Green Mountain, blue water is the gold mountain, and gold water is already deeply embedded into Chinese concept. And also you have these labor rights that has to be respected. And now China calls for common prosperity, exactly trying to raise the labor of the migrant workers in the cities. And also digital economy. Digital economy, China is now one of the largest digital economy. Digital economies already counts about 38% of China's GDP now. And of course, you mentioned about SOE, which is, I think, big worry overseas. But, why can't we really follow some competitive neutrality? Maybe in China, SOE is more needed, but when they perform outside, they could do a follow-up competitive neutrality, which is internationally recognized. So there could be ways to talk. If Vietnam
I agree with most of what you've said. I think an American would respond, or at least many Americans would respond, that they're reluctant to make new agreements with China on the economics when we didn't get satisfaction on the phase 1 trade deal. So one thing I was hoping might come out of the Xi-Biden talk was some movement forward that would allow American politicians to say, we negotiated with China, we didn't get everything we wanted, but when we did agree, China lived up to it. Now, of course, the COVID virus came along. Our bilateral relationship had many problems. So objectively speaking, you can understand why there have been problems.
Yeah.
But the average American realizes that there were agreements to purchase large amounts of US exports, and basically that has not happened. Of course, Chinese would say, you Americans threw tariffs on us, and not only on us, but even American allies. So in any case, I think we have to find a way to restore trust in previous agreements before there's too much appetite for new agreements. But I do, and you said one thing I thought was very, one of many things, very insightful, and that you said that actually European countries have expressed some, I'm not sure how much, but some interest in the PTPP or CPTPP. And I would say the more Europeans that express interest, and the more interest China really expresses in getting in that organization, you'll find the Americans will not want to be left out. So, so I think in some sense, let's try to repair as best we can past agreements, or at least live up to them going forward, and restore credibility to the idea of negotiation. And then I think if China and others move towards multilateralism, the CPTPP, you'll find the Americans will get more interested. That's my prediction.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Actually, I was at symposium webinar with virtual webinar yesterday with Kobo Foundation of Germany, and actually there were people suggesting EU should be in the CPTPP as well. So this kind of multilateral arrangement, it does help the world prosperity. Like China joined WTO. This year is about 20 years anniversary of China joined WTO. China's import from the world has gone up 6 times,
Right.
and the export has gone up 7 times.
Right.
So, but still, it's a relatively
right. But Europe's a complicated place, and generally speaking, the Germans are pretty forward-leaning on relations with China, particularly economic relations. And I would just say, as a piece of friendly advice, I think China needs to, once again, remember Chairman Mao had the 3 worlds theory.
Yes.
And essentially there was the Soviet world, there was the American world, and then there were the intermediate zones, the middle-sized powers. And I always thought it was a great strength of Chinese foreign policy to consolidate or to focus its energies on the middle powers, on the intermediate zones, so to speak. Now, we didn't like the way China focused on those, but the idea of keeping the middle powers at least friendly to China, I think is an important idea. And frankly, it seems to me China's relations with several very important middle powers could use some repair.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. I think that because I think with the trade war, tariff war launched by Trump administration, that actually impacted many things. But also now Blinken and Biden comes up, they are seeking alliance of a kind of AUKUS or Quad, all coming up against China somehow. So I think you're right. I mean, we need to, unite, or maybe have friendly relation with as many countries as possible. I mean, that certainly is the way I think China should go. Absolutely.